Most people can't even light a campfire on a sunny day. So, how did Native Americans manage to spark flames in the middle of pouring rain when their lives depended on it? Rain has this nasty habit of showing up at the worst possible times. Your stomach's growling, darkness is creeping in, and then, splash, Mother Nature decides to dump buckets of water on everything you need to survive. For Native Americans living across North America, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a matter of life and death. When you're dealing with wet forests, soaked wood, and rain that seems determined to ruin your day, starting a fire becomes one of the toughest challenges you'll ever face. But here's the thing. They absolutely had to make it work. Fire wasn't optional. It never is when survival's on the line. You need warmth to keep hypothermia from turning you into a human popsicle. You need cooking heat to make food safe and digestible. Wild animals? They don't like fire much, which makes it your best nighttime security system. And for many tribes, fire held sacred importance in ceremonies that couldn't be postponed just because the sky was having a tantrum. The brutal truth is that ordinary fire-starting methods crumble when everything's drenched. That tinder you collected yesterday? Useless, soggy mess. Those perfectly dry sticks you found? Now they're basically waterlogged sponges. Even your fire-starting tools can become slippery, uncooperative nightmares when rain gets involved. This is where things get interesting, though. Native Americans didn't just throw their hands up and accept defeat when the weather turned against them. They developed techniques that seem almost magical when you first learn about them. We're talking about methods so clever, so perfectly adapted to wet conditions that modern survival experts still study and use them today. The difference between success and freezing came down to knowledge passed through generations. Each tribe developed their own tricks, tested through countless rainy nights and refined by necessity. Some techniques were so effective they could coax flames from materials that looked completely hopeless. But this wasn't just about having the right techniques. It required understanding wood in ways most people never consider, knowing exactly where to look for dry materials even when everything appeared soaked, and developing an almost supernatural patience for the delicate process of nursing a tiny spark into roaring flames. The weather could throw its worst tantrums, dump rain for days, and soak every visible surface. Yet skilled firemakers could still create warmth, safety, and cooking heat when others would have given up entirely. What made this possible wasn't luck or magic. It was systematic knowledge that started with one crucial decision. Before you could even think about sparks or tinder, you had to solve the most basic problem first. Once you've got that precious spark going, the next battle is finding somewhere it won't get instantly murdered by raindrops. Native Americans knew this better than anyone. They couldn't just pack up and head home when the weather turned nasty. The secret wasn't magic. It was location scouting like their lives depended on it. Because, honestly, sometimes it did. Rock overhangs were pure gold. These natural shelters created perfect pockets where rain couldn't reach, and the stone underneath stayed relatively dry even during heavy downpours. Smart tribes would scout these spots during good weather, mentally cataloging them for future emergencies. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets clever. When natural shelter wasn't available, they made their own. Some groups carried specially prepared animal hides or woven mats that could be quickly rigged into temporary rain shields. Picture a small lean-to, just big enough to protect that crucial first flame. These portable shelters were lightweight but incredibly effective at keeping the initial spark alive. Then there's the ground problem. Wet earth sucks heat away from fires faster than you can say hypothermia. Native firemakers solved this by building elevated platforms using flat stones or thick pieces of bark. The air gap underneath prevented moisture from seeping up and killing the flame before it had a chance to establish itself. Dense tree canopies worked too, especially old-growth forests where multiple layers of branches created natural umbrellas. The Ojibwe and other woodland tribes became experts at reading forest architecture, knowing exactly which spots would stay driest during storms. They'd look for areas where thick evergreen boughs overlapped, creating what essentially amounted to nature's own roof system. While some tribes got even more creative. They'd dig shallow fire pits and line them with stones, creating mini fireplaces that could be partially covered with flat rocks or bark sheets. This technique let them control airflow while keeping most of the rain out, kind of like an ancient wood stove. The weird part is how they'd sometimes build fires right next to large tree trunks or boulder faces. These vertical surfaces acted like walls, reflecting heat back toward the fire maker while providing partial wind protection. Plus, the thermal mass of stone or wood would gradually warm up, creating a more comfortable microclimate for tending the flames. Location wasn't just about staying dry, though, it was about setting up for success. The right spot had to balance shelter with ventilation, protection with accessibility. Too much cover and the fire would suffocate. Too little and the rain would win. But even the perfect spot means nothing without the right materials to burn. Native American firemaking wasn't just about rubbing two sticks together and hoping for the best. These weren't desperate survival attempts. They were precise engineering solutions perfected over centuries. The bow drill stands as perhaps the most genius invention you've never properly appreciated. A curved piece of wood, some cordage, and a spinning stick that could generate enough friction heat to ignite tinder even when everything around was soaking wet. The beauty? Once you mastered the rhythm, sparks came reliably. But here's what most people miss. The really smart tribes didn't just carry bow drills. They carried pre-made fire sets. The Chinook people, living in one of the rainiest places on Earth, weren't taking chances. They prepared complete fire-starting kits during dry weather, then wrapped them in waterproof materials for emergencies. These weren't just tools thrown together randomly. Each piece was carefully selected wood that worked together perfectly. Then there's flint and steel, which might surprise you since we think of it as European technology. Many native tribes adopted this method because steel strikes created hot sparks that could ignite tinder faster than friction methods. Rain couldn't stop a good spark from flying, and experienced hands knew exactly how to catch those sparks before they died. But the real secret weapon? Pine pitch and tree resin. This sticky, aromatic substance was like carrying liquid fire in your pocket. Even when wet on the outside, pine pitch burns incredibly hot once lit. Smart fire makers collected this golden treasure during warm seasons, storing it in small containers made from hollowed bones or tightly woven baskets sealed with more resin. What made these tools truly effective wasn't just their design, it was the constant improvement. Each generation refined the techniques, making adjustments based on their specific environment. A bow drill that worked perfectly in Arizona desert might need modifications for Pacific Northwest rainforests. The weird part is how personal these tools became. Master fire makers often crafted their own sets, knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, which wood combinations worked best, and how their particular tools responded in different weather conditions. These weren't mass-produced items you could just hand to someone else and expect the same results. Some tribes even created backup systems for their backup systems. Multiple fire-starting methods, spare materials, and emergency tinder, all carefully maintained and ready for the worst conditions. Of course, having the right tools was only half the battle. The other half involved knowing where to find dry materials when everything looked completely soaked, and that required a completely different kind of expertise. Finding dry materials when everything around you is soaked seems impossible. Well, Native Americans figured out that nature always hides secrets if you know where to look. The trick wasn't searching harder, it was searching smarter. Cedar and basswood trees became lifesavers during storms. Their outer bark might be dripping wet, but peel back those soggy layers and you'll find bone-dry inner bark underneath. This stuff catches fire like it's been waiting all day for a spark. The Ojibwe called it weegob and treated it like gold. Why? Because even after days of rain, that inner bark stayed perfectly dry, protected by nature's own raincoat. Then there's pine sap, which might be the closest thing to magic that exists in the forest. This sticky, amber treasure burns so hot it practically laughs at water. Native people collected it during dry seasons, storing chunks in leather pouches for emergencies. When rain turned everything into a soggy mess, a small piece of pine sap could turn the wettest kindling into roaring flames. But here's where things get really clever. Most people look for wood on the ground when they need fuel. Wrong move. That fallen log has been soaking up moisture like a sponge. Smart fire builders went vertical instead. Standing dead trees, especially ones that died recently, keep their insides surprisingly dry even during heavy downpours. The outer wood gets wet, sure, but split it open and you'll find dry wood waiting inside. Native Americans carried sharp knives and small hatchets specifically for this wood surgery. They'd slice into waterlogged stumps and fallen logs, carving away the wet exterior to reach the dry heart inside. Takes more work than grabbing random sticks, but the payoff was enormous. Let's not forget the preparation angle. Experienced fire makers never waited for emergencies to find good tinder. During sunny days, they collected the best dry materials, shredded bark, pine needles, birch paper, and stored them in waterproof containers made from animal bladders or tightly woven baskets sealed with tree pitch. Some tribes got incredibly creative with storage. They'd wrap precious tinder bundles in layers of birch bark, then coat the whole package with pine resin. These weatherproof fire kits could survive river crossings and week-long storms without losing their spark-catching ability. The weird part is how different tribes developed totally different strategies based on their local trees and climate. What worked perfectly for the Pacific Northwest peoples might fail miserably in the Southwest deserts. Once you've gathered these carefully selected dry materials, the real challenge begins, arranging them into a fire structure that actually works in terrible weather. You found your dry materials and got your fire-starting tools ready. Great. But here's where most people mess up completely. They just dump everything together and hope for the best. Native Americans knew better. They understood that wet weather demanded a totally different fire architecture. First rule, never build directly on soaked ground. The earth will suck the heat right out of your precious flames faster than you can say, extinct campfire. Instead, tribes created elevated platforms using two thick logs placed parallel to each other. These logs acted like a stage for the fire, lifting it away from the moisture-hungry soil below. Smart, right? But here's the tricky part. Size matters, and bigger isn't always better. When everything around you is dripping wet, you want to start small. Really small. Think of it like protecting a newborn baby from a thunderstorm. The smaller your initial fire, the easier it becomes to shield it with your body, a piece of bark, or even your jacket. Once those first flames take hold and start generating serious heat, then you can gradually feed it larger pieces. The starfire technique was pure genius for rainy conditions. Instead of stacking wood in a traditional teepee shape, you arrange longer pieces of wood like spokes on a wheel with all the ends meeting in the center. As the ends burn, you simply push the logs inward. This method lets wet fuel dry out at the far ends while the fire burns the ready pieces in the middle. It's like having a wood drying factory built right into your fire. Then there's the airflow puzzle. Fires need oxygen to breathe, but rain needs to stay out. Native Americans solved this by creating strategic windbreaks, stones, bark sheets, or even their own bodies positioned to block rain while leaving gaps for air circulation. Too much protection and your fire suffocates. Too little and the rain kills it. Finding that sweet spot took serious skill. The biggest mistake? Crowding the fire with too much wet wood too fast. When you're cold and desperate, it's tempting to pile on every piece of fuel you can find. But wet wood creates steam, which cools everything down and can actually smother your flames. Patience was everything. Each piece had to earn its place in the fire by being dry enough to contribute heat rather than steal it. What made this whole system work wasn't just technique, it was understanding exactly which materials could handle moisture and still burn hot when you needed them most. Getting that first spark was just the beginning. The real skill came in what happened next. Protecting that tiny flame like your life depended on it. Because honestly, it often did. The moment a spark caught in dry tinder, experienced fire makers would cup their hands around it like a protective shell. Their bodies became human umbrellas, blocking raindrops from hitting the fragile ember. Some would pull their hood forward or drape a piece of hide over their shoulders, creating a mini shelter just big enough for their hands and the growing flame. But here's where it gets tricky. You can't just blow on a spark like you're trying to inflate a balloon. Too much air scatters the ember, too little, and it dies from lack of oxygen. Native fire makers learned to breathe on their tinder with the gentleness of a summer breeze, coaxing the spark to spread without overwhelming it. The transfer technique was pure art. Once the ember started glowing in the tinder bundle, they'd lift it carefully, like holding a baby bird, and move it to the prepared fire lay. One wrong move, one jarring motion, and hours of work could literally go up in smoke. Well, actually, it wouldn't go up in smoke at all, which was the whole problem. Then there's the patience factor. Modern people want everything instantly. Fast food, quick downloads, immediate results. But these fire makers understood that rushing meant failure. They'd tend their growing flame for what felt like forever, gradually adding slightly larger pieces of kindling, waiting for each addition to catch before adding the next. Weather reading became second nature too. They knew that a light drizzle required different protection than a steady downpour. Wind patterns mattered. A breeze from the wrong direction could doom their efforts, while air from the right angle could help their fire breathe and grow stronger. Some tribes developed hand signals for group fire-making efforts. One person would work the spark while others formed windbreaks with their bodies or held makeshift shelters overhead. Teamwork made the difference between success and spending a cold, miserable night in the rain. The most skilled fire-makers could read their materials like a book. They knew exactly how long cedar bark would smolder before needing more fuel, or when pine pitch was hot enough to ignite wet kindling. This knowledge came from years of practice, countless failures, and careful observation of what worked. These weren't just survival skills, they were the foundation of daily life. And speaking of foundations, the materials they chose to burn made all the difference in whether their fires would actually stay lit in terrible weather. Not all fire fuel is created equal, especially when Mother Nature decides to dump buckets of water on your survival plans. While most wood becomes as useful as a soggy sandwich in the rain, certain materials laugh in the face of wet weather. These weren't just lucky discoveries either. Native Americans spent centuries figuring out which fuels would save their lives when everything else failed. Birch bark deserves its own Hall of Fame. This stuff burns like it's been soaked in gasoline, thanks to natural oils that repel water. Even after sitting in a downpour for hours, you could peel off a strip and watch it ignite instantly. The Ojibwe knew this secret well, collecting birch bark during dry seasons and storing it like precious currency. Smart move, considering it could mean the difference between a warm meal and gnawing on cold jerky. Then there's fatwood, which old-timers called nature's gasoline, for good reason. When pine trees get injured or die, they pump resin into their heartwood as a last-ditch survival effort. This creates chunks of wood so loaded with flammable sap that they'll burn even underwater. Well, almost. The Cherokee would hunt for these golden treasures, knowing that a single piece could start a fire in weather that would defeat lesser materials. Cedar bark fibers were another game changer. While the outer bark got soaked, the inner fibers stayed surprisingly dry and caught sparks faster than gossip spreads in a small town. Native firemakers would shred these fibers into bird's nest bundles, creating tinder so effective that even the weakest spark could bloom into flame. These bundles were often stored in waterproof containers made from animal bladders or tightly woven baskets. But here's where things get really clever. Some tribes took weatherproofing to the next level by creating their own fire insurance policies. They'd coat bundles of dry materials with animal fat or pine pitch, essentially vacuum sealing their fire starters centuries before plastic wrap existed. These waterproof packets could survive river crossings, torrential storms, and the kind of weather that makes you question your life choices. The Haida even developed fire bundles wrapped in oiled cedar bark, sealed so tight that they could float downstream and still light perfectly. Talk about thinking ahead. These weren't just backup plans either. In the Pacific Northwest, where rain falls like clockwork, these weatherproof fuels became essential survival tools. Having the right materials meant the difference between thriving and merely surviving another miserable, cold night. To Native Americans, fire was more than survival. It was proof of their harmony with the earth. Rain or shine, their strategies kept the flame alive.